About 12 o'clock we turned out and went up along the bank. The river was coming up pretty fast, and lots of driftwood going by on the rise. By and by along comes part of a log raft, 9 logs, fast together. We went out with the skiff and towed it ashore. Then we had dinner. Anybody but Pap would have waited and seen the day through so as to catch more stuff. But that warn't Pap's style. 9 logs was enough for one time. He must shove right out over to town and sell, so he locked me in and took the skiff and started off towing the raft about 3:30. I judged he wouldn't come back that night. I waited till I reckoned he had a good start. Then I was out with my saw and went to work on that log again. Before he was to the other side of the river, I was out of the hole. Him and his raft was just a speck on the water away off yonder. I took the sack of cornmeal and took it to where the canoe was hid, and shoved the vines and branches apart and put it in. Then I done the same with the side of bacon and the whiskey jug. I took all the coffee and sugar there was and all the ammunition. I took the wadding, I took the bucket and gourd, the dipper and a tin cup and my old saw and 2 blankets and the skillet and the coffee pot. I had wore the ground a good deal crawling out of the hole and dragging out so many things, so I fixed that as good as I could from the outside by scattering dust on the place. It was all grass clear to the canoe, so I hadn't left a track. I followed around to see. I stood on the bank and looked out over the river, all safe. So I took the gun and went up a piece into the woods and was hunting around for some birds when I see a wild pig. I shot this fellow and took him to camp. I took the axe and smashed in the door. I beat it and hacked it considerable a doing it. I fetched the pig in and took him back nearly to the table and hacked into his throat with the axe and laid him down on the ground to bleed. Well, next I took an old sack and put a lot of big rocks in it, all I could drag, and I started it from the pig and dragged it to the door, through the woods, down to the river and dumped it in, and down it sunk, out of sight. You could easy see that something had been dragged over the ground. Well, last I pulled out some of my hair and blooded the axe good and stuck it on the backside and slung the axe in the corner. Then I took up the pig and held him to my breast with my jacket so he couldn't drip, till I got a good piece below the house and then dumped him in the river. Later on, it was kind of solemn, drifting down the big, still river, laying on our backs looking up at the stars, and we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it weren't often that we laughed, only a little, kind of a low chuckle.
All right. Thanks for that. So, a couple of very famous passages from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, written in 1880, what did we say, 1888?
1884, published in 1884.
Published in 1884. Considered by many to be the greatest American novel. So, those of us working on our own novels, it's already been done, folks. We we wanted to do this novel on this podcast on Fathers and Sons. I think for a couple of reasons. I read this as a kid, and I remember Pap, reading and being terrified by the character of Pap. Huckleberry Finn is a young kid. He's maybe 14 years old, and he's got this absentee father. And we'll get to this a little bit. And Pap comes back. We meet Huckleberry Finn in the prequel, which is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And in Tom Sawyer, the boys find a bunch of money, and treasure, right? They find treasure. And it's all about adventures. And Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn find money. It's like $6,000 or something. And in the beginning of Huck Finn, Pap, this old drunk father of Huck Finn, who's usually away, comes back and he sees the boot print in the snow, this cross, nail cross in the heel in the snow, and he knows Pap is back, and he's terrified.
So scared. He's so scared he runs to the judge and asks to give away all his money so his
That's
dad
right.
doesn't have a reason to come back. Yeah.
He knows his dad is back for one reason only, to get a hold of that treasure. So I remember that, being a kid and being terrified by this lanky-haired old geezer of a absentee father. And then I also remember Jim, the escaped slave, which I'm sure we'll get to as well. And I thought of the dynamic between Huck and Jim and this sort of fatherly, what I remembered as sort of a fatherly relationship. And so we thought let's do this story and kind of explore those. I think my thinking on these relationships has changed a little bit. Maybe because I've grown older. Maybe because when I read it as a kid, I didn't read it in the same way. But anyway, I thought we'd explore some of the themes of fatherhood in Huck Finn. So where do you want to start, Luke?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we go through the story a little bit. There's a few pieces that I think are most important. I mean, I think you got to start with Pap Finn. Beginning of the book, like you said, Huck Finn is sort of riding high from, well, kind of. He's riding high in quotes from this adventure that he and Tom Sawyer went on. They found a bunch of money, um, and they're rich. Tom and Huck are rich now, and Huck's adopted by the old widow, um, and they're trying to civilize him. Turn him into teach him how to read, teach him how to wear clothes, like
Yeah.
just try to turn him into a regular boy. Um,
And I guess for those who haven't read it or who have read it a long time ago, this is sort of frontier, antebellum, pre-Civil War Missouri,
hmm
uh, right up against the Mississippi River. So the river looms large through everything. And Huck, considers himself to be kind of a wild child, and he grew up without a mom and just with Pap, and mostly kind of wild, never wore shoes, barely wore clothes. And he's friends with Tom Sawyer, who is from town, um, but Huck is very much kind of a redneck, wild boy, and so the widow kind of takes him in after these adventures and tries to civilize him. That's right.
Yeah. One of the best parts at the beginning of the book is when Huck's talking about the food that they feed him. And he talks about how he doesn't like town food because everything's not mixed together.
Yeah,
The flavors don't mix together. I always remembered that from when I was a kid.
yeah,
So Huck, right? He doesn't really want to be there. He doesn't want to be in town. In fact, he doesn't even really want the money. He doesn't care about the money at all. And when his dad comes back, he tries to get rid of it, tries to get the Judge Thatcher, to take the money from him.
yeah.
Um, but that
Judge
doesn't
that
happen.
kind of a legal guardian
Yeah,
of his interest in the treasure.
yeah, that's right. He invests the money for Tom and Huck. Um, but that doesn't happen, and Pap comes back and wants the money, and he kidnaps Huck in order to get it. Basically, he takes him away from the widow, and there's no real legal recourse for anybody to get Huck back. It's the frontier, like you said, so there's not really any kind of salvation coming for Huck. So he's stuck in this cabin with his dad, and his dad locks the door at night, has a gun that Huck's afraid he'll shoot him with, beats him all the time, and it's interesting because Huck talks about this and kind of likes being with his dad.
Yeah.
He likes being out of town again and not having to read, not having to say his prayers. Um, but he doesn't like getting beat, and he doesn't like being scared all the time. So there's definitely this relationship that I find very interesting, of a son who can appreciate some things about his dad, can appreciate the way his dad lives, even while dealing with such a obviously abusive and corrosive father.
He there's a couple of things that I noticed this time around. Um, his father sort of has this illusion of authoritarianism, right? He has this authoritarian approach. He accuses Huck of putting on airs, right? Because Huck has gone to school and Pap is illiterate.
Yeah,
Pap doesn't know how to read, and none of the Finns know how to read. They're frontier sort of people who do not do that. And so Huck has gone, lived in town. He has store bought clothes. That's a big, they're not homespun. They're store bought. And so Pap like makes him read for him and then beats him afterwards
Yeah, that's true.
when he shows him that he can actually read. Um, Pap drinks, and when Pap is drinking whiskey, he gets really mean, and he gets so drunk one time that he tries to actually gets into a tremors, and he tries to actually kill. Remember that time he tries to actually kill?
Yeah, he chases Huck around the cabin.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's the point at which Huck determines he's gonna escape. But there is this, like you say, there's this sort of strange, like Huck begins to shed the trappings of society, a society that Huck's not completely comfortable with. And one of the interesting themes of the book, and I think we have to acknowledge Mark Twain's warning at the
Yeah,
beginning of the book that, basically there's a notice, maybe I'll read it.
yeah, you should read it.
The book, it's kind of funny. He says, persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot.
We're risking the executioner's bullet here.
Yeah, by order of the author. So we're doing exactly what Mark Twain didn't want us to do. But one of the themes throughout the book is the hypocrisy of Southern genteel town society that is so ordered and so rules based and so religious, so Christian. Now, I'm going to put that in quotes because they own people and they beat and torture the black slaves. And slavery runs throughout this entire narrative. And there's this story of Jim, the escaped slave, that we'll get to. And Huck is happy to be shed of that, not going to church, not going to school, not having to sit at a table and mind his P's and Q's, even though the price of it, he says, I don't mind getting my hide tanned a little, from time to time by Pap, as long as it's not too bad and I don't have to wear shoes and I can stir all my food together on my plate.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, right? He's got this sort of freedom freedom from both the social constraints of town and also from what he later starts to recognize as things that are contrary to his beliefs in the establishment and in the slave culture. But it's not. I think we got to be real clear. It's not like his dad is the good alternative either. I mean, his dad is extremely racist, and is in a lot of ways the archetype of sort of a poor um, white racism at the time.
Yeah.
So this novel is published, like we said, in the end of like the 1885, 1880 or 1884, 1885, which was right when the Reconstruction was sort of collapsing in the United States, and um, black people in the U.S. were starting to essentially be recommitted into slavery through legal loopholes and things like that.
Jim
And
Crow.
this, yeah, Jim Crow era, 100%. And a lot of it was coming from these kind of resentful, poor white folk who Pap is a definite archetype of. So to me, it feels like Huck is trapped between these two extremes of, his father's angry, um, vengeful racism, and then the casual but no less terrible racism of the townsfolk. And the only time that Huck feels comfortable and free and happy is when he's out on the river and he's shoeless and you know shirtless and able to be away from the kind of the poison of society. So, in response to being captured by his dad and being beat and being, stuck in this cage, and then when his dad tries to kill him, he escapes. And that's the scene we read at the beginning where he basically fakes his own death. He
Yeah.
kills a pig, spreads blood everywhere, um, makes it look like some people came in and robbed the cabin and killed him. And then all of this is because he was able to find a canoe out on the river. And then he escapes again because of the river. The river offers freedom, and that's kind of
Absolutely.
a recurring theme. And he gets away and floats down to an island, and he's free. He's safe. People look for him for a while. He sees a steamboat kind of driving around looking for his body, but he's able to get away long enough that he's free.
And Pap is on the steamboat. Remember
Pap's on
that?
the steamboat with the judge, with the widow, with Tom Sawyer, with all the
Yep.
characters, right? They're all kind of together for a moment. Um, so after all of this happens, we'll kind of get into the rest of the story, but I think there's a central paradox here that we've kind of skirted around, but that is really important and matters a lot to our theme of this relationship between fathers and sons, which is that Huck's sort of fatherlessness is Huck's neglect and abandonment, while being genuinely traumatic, does leave him unusually unformed by society's worst lessons. And so he is able, no one bothered to properly civilize him, right?
Yeah.
So he is able to genuinely feel things that other people can't. And the rest of the book is essentially about him growing a conscience in a way that is unadulterated in the most literal sense of that word.
Well, and he gets just sort of a taste of moral teaching from the widow and from Aunt Polly and from some of the other characters, most of whom are women.
Hmm.
Actually, one of the impressions that I had as I studied the book a little more carefully was how matriarchal it is. That most of the formation, most of the rules, and most of the civilization and the morality teaching was done by women, and that may have been a reflection of Southern culture at the time. Maybe it's a reflection of American culture more broadly. I mean, we learn a lot from our mothers and our female, our women, family members. But what he learned was that he was somehow flawed, that he somehow it just didn't stick. He just wasn't right. Something was wrong with him. That
Yeah, there's that whole part where he's talking about praying and he's like, it doesn't work for me.
I just can't pray. Somehow I just can't pray a lie. I just
Yeah.
can't. I just can't seem to understand how to pray, or I can't believe the same things that these people believe, basically. And a lot of it, as the book goes through, has to do with freedom of slaves. And him recognizing, we're going to get to Jim in a second on the island, I think, but recognizing that this man Jim, who he becomes very good friends with, um, is actually a person like everybody else, and he just believes that as he helps this black slave escape, he knows he's just a low down cuss, because only a low down cuss would help a slave escape from people that had done him no harm. This was the widow's slave, and he was helping this slave escape, and that was the most low down thing a Southerner could do. And it just he knew he was going to go to hell for it. When reading it today, we think of that as noble, to try to help a downtrodden person who's been unfairly, in the chains of bondage escape. That's heroic. And Twain is doing this on purpose. Of course, Twain was anti-slavery, but Huck just can't seem to quite capture the morality that he's being taught.
Yeah, agreed. So we next find Huck, right? He's on this island. He's gotten away from Pap. He's in the clear, and he's on the island, and he runs into Jim. Jim was, like you mentioned, the widow's slave. So Jim and Huck know each other. They know each other quite well. They were living in the same house. Um, but Huck doesn't know that Jim has escaped, and Jim actually thinks Huck is a ghost at first. It's a great scene. Jim's very superstitious. There's a lot of good stuff in the book about Jim's kind of belief system. Um, but they end up deciding to travel together. And at first, to be clear, Huck is not sort of helping Jim escape at first in kind of a conscious manner. It's not that he's setting himself against the societal mores. He actually goes to town to try to find out what's going on. And someone tells him that they think they saw Jim and they're going to try to go find Jim. Huck's in disguise at this point. And Huck's instinct is to get back to the island and help Jim get away. And it's not until after they escape that Huck realizes that he has done something wrong
Yeah, what
in
he's
the
done.
in the morals of the day. So I think that's just really important to point out that it's not a conscious decision at first. It's genuinely just Huck has this reaction of, oh, I gotta help him. I gotta help Jim. And then he realizes, oh no, I've done something terrible.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of unlearning going on where Huck has to, his moral development is this act of unlearning the things that the society he lives in have tried to kind of cram down his throat, um, which culminate in that moment, the famous line, all right, then I'll go to hell, where he just
I guess
accepts
I'll
it.
I guess I'll have to go to hell.
So
Yeah.
good. So most of the book, and we won't have time to cover all of the things that happen. Everybody should read this book. It's so good. But
And it's
they,
entertaining and funny
yeah,
and kind of
and
heartbreaking.
there's characters you love and characters you hate. Um, so they travel down the river, and their goal is to get to the place where the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers intersect, and then go up the Ohio to the north where Jim can be free. And then Jim wants to buy back his family. Jim has a wife and kids. Um, so they're trying to make it to Cairo, which is this town at the intersection of these two rivers. Um,
Let me say
now,
something
yeah,
about
go ahead.
Jim, if I could. Like I said, one of the things that I thought we would find when we read the book was sort of a father figure in Jim. And I have to confess that I didn't see that as we read. And I'm
Okay.
I'm curious your reaction.
Yeah.
Um, Definitely there's some wisdom. Jim kind of homespun, common sense. Mark Twain portrays Jim as a level-headed, intelligent man, right? And I think goes to great lengths to do that. But he also portrays him in a childlike way. And Huck is often in a position of sort of superior knowledge and understanding and authority over Jim. And because Jim is a slave, and Jim is politically, in terms of sort of his rights, the suite of rights that he has, not able to fend for himself in the same way that Huck is. And so it's a very interesting dynamic between the two of them. There's a scene you'll remember when they get separated in a fog,
Yeah.
and Huck plays a really kind of mean-spirited trick on Jim. Jim is very superstitious and he believes in magic and dreams and stuff.
Witches.
Yeah, witches and all kinds of stuff. And Huck makes Jim believe that he had dreamt this whole very scary experience of being separated in the fog. Jim was really worried about Huck, and they'd been hooting to each other, and they got separated between an island and stuff. And Huck does this very mean-spirited thing and makes Jim feel very scared. And then Jim realizes that he'd been duped and is so disappointed and so sad that Huck, who he thought was his friend, would play this trick on him, and goes into the little wigwam that they built on their raft and just said, I wouldn't have thought my best friend would have treated me like that. And that's not really sort of a father-son kind of a dynamic. And so it just kind of struck me that these were, Huck and Jim were learning about each other more as peers. I don't know if you have any thoughts about
Yeah. I think that scene is one of I think it might be one of the most important points in the book and one of the most impactful like moral turning points in any book I've read for a number of reasons. So I do think there are some father-like things that Jim does. Jim, there's a lot of points where Jim will basically take Huck's watch on the raft and not wake him up and let him sleep. Um, and there's points at which Jim will do things that are self-sacrificial for Huck. And even at the very end of the book, spoilers here, but Huck, or sorry, Tom Sawyer comes into the book at the end and he gets shot in the leg. Um, through basically it's his own fault, but he gets
He's
shot in the leg.
he's trying to save Jim. I put that in quotes.
Yeah, yeah,
We won't go into too much detail there because it's pretty hilarious.
it is. So he gets shot in the leg, and really the only way for him to be saved, there's a lot of context here, but Jim has to give himself up to save Tom, and he does. There are multiple points at which Jim does the thing that fathers do, which is sacrifice themselves for their kids. So I do think there's an element to that relationship. But I also think you're right that there's um, a lot more kind of give and take than there would be in a father-son relationship. It's much more like a friendship, you know? I mean, Jim is so sad when Huck tricks him. He says, I'm just going to read this real quick, and
Yeah, dude.
I'm going to try to read this because it's written differently than I speak.
Well,
Um,
do it. Yeah, go
yeah,
for it.
so this is right after Huck tricks Jim, and Huck asks Jim, he kind of admits to the joke, and Jim says, "When I got all wore out with work and with calling for you and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost, and I did care no more what became of me or the raft. And then when I wake up and find you back again, all safe and sound, the tears come, and I could have got down on my knees and kissed your feet. I was so thankful. And all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. That truck there is trash, and trash is what people that put dirt on the head of they's friend and make 'em ashamed." Then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam and went in there without saying anything but that was enough. Made me feel so mean I could almost have kissed his foot to get him to take it back. I mean, it's so heartbreaking just the way that. So I think that this is a moment where the reader realizes, oh, this is not just a story about like a couple of friends going down the river. It's not just a silly story about like, this adventure, this child who's, used to adventures, kind of going on an adventure with an escaped slave. This is a real person here. Jim is a man,
That's right.
um, with feelings and important things to think about and say. And I want to say one more thing about that. I have not read a lot of early American literature, but I don't think it was common to portray black characters as emotionally um, complex as Jim is. There's a scene in Huck Finn where Jim talks about beating his daughter, about slapping
Um,
his daughter.
so
So
good.
his daughter had scarlet fever, I think.
Yep.
And Jim talks about seeing her standing there and saying something to her, and she doesn't respond. She just smiles
Close
back.
the door. Close the
Yeah, close
door.
the door. That's what it is. Close the door. And she doesn't respond. She just looks at him, kind of smiles, and so he yells it at her, and she doesn't respond. And so he goes and slaps her. And then when like he realizes what has happened, he kind of gets down and tries to talk to her, and he realizes that she's deaf. That scarlet fever has made her
Well,
deaf.
the door blows closed
Right.
and she doesn't move. It scares him and she doesn't move.
Yeah. And he's so heartbroken about the fact that he did that. Um, and when I first read that, it made me mad at Jim. And I was like, well, that's that's terrible. Why would you do that, Jim? That's awful. But thinking back and looking at it again, it's like I don't know that that's the kind of thing that most, especially white authors, would have written about a black man at that time, you know? the whole narrative of slavery, especially the separation of families, was based off of this idea that black men's feelings didn't exist, that they didn't care about their kids, that they were animals, that they didn't care that their families were separated from them. But Jim is like, I mean, he says, the Lord God Almighty forgive poor old Jim because he's never going to forgive himself as long as he lives. Like he's so torn up about this. So anyway, that scene changed for me from a moment of not liking Jim to recognizing that Jim's just a guy. He's just human and he makes mistakes just like everybody else does. So I would agree with you. I don't think that this is a father-son relationship so much as it is just a relationship between two people who
Two people.
are equally morally broken, but also who have, really good things that they do.
Yeah, yeah, and I just to build off to build onto that, I think the scene where Jim gives himself up to save Tom Sawyer is an example, and he does it twice actually. They're escaping. I mean, they're leaving. They're on their way out. And Tom has been shot in the leg, and Tom is saying, "What are you doing? This is great. I'm glad I got shot," because Tom is like a hopeless romantic, and they've engineered this great escape, and they could have escaped so much simpler, and Tom just wants it to be really complicated. That's a whole separate set of probably a whole separate discussion about romanticism.
Hmm.
Mark Twain was the enemy of romanticism. He was a realist, and Tom's romanticism got them into hot water at the end in their great escape, and he wanted to just keep going. And Jim said, "No, we got to stop. We got to go get a doctor. Tom is hurt." And so they stop. And then later he sacrifices himself again, even though he knows it will mean going back into slavery. And I wrote down that is an example of manliness. That is manly virtue. Virtue in the original sense of the word. Um, Sacrifice and bravery. Those kinds of manly virtues that we aspire to as men. And so, what Huck learns about his friend Jim as they travel down the river is that Jim is a complex individual with eternal worth. He's a soul, just like Huck is. And, at one point, Huck actually comments, "I knowed he was white inside," which, is not the way I would describe it necessarily, but in the context of, of, Southern pre-war Southern society, that's
Especially coming out of the mouth of a 14-year-old boy, it's not
that's the
like,
best way he could try to describe it. And I think
yeah,
what Twain was commenting on, was that this that out of the mouth of this sort of young child came the truth about how evil this slave society really was.
yeah. Every authority figure in the book is a moral failure. Pap is maybe the worst. He's both abusive and complicit in the slave economy, and he rages. There's a point at which he rages against a free black man and talks about how the government is, um, going to hell because they don't put him back into slavery. So Pap's probably the worst. But everybody else fails too. I mean, the Widow Douglas, Miss Watson represent a Christianity that is comfortable with owning human beings. Um, the the King and the Duke, who we aren't probably going to talk about as much, but are sort of authority figures. Um, but they're horrible fraudsters who end up. The ending of their story is that they sell Jim back into slavery for $40, which is not very much. Judge Thatcher is impotent and complicit. Basically, everyone that is part of the American authority structure, religious, legal, economic, social, they are either actively evil or they are complicit in slavery.
Yeah.
So I think this is a radical book
It is.
because it's basically saying that the I think the fact that the river is the place of freedom, there's definitely something about, Thomas Jefferson-esque, like, connection to the land and the the beauty of the American continent and that kind of a thing being a moral teacher. But it's really this young kid who has not had the lessons driven in deep enough to him because he's wild. He's the only one who sees what the problems are. And
Yeah.
it's in a strange way because his father is such a failure.
Yeah.
Which is it kind of makes us fathers question whether we're the job we're doing and whether we're needed at all. If fatherhood isn't more for the fathers than it is for the kids.
Well, I think it's a joint project for sure. You made a comment about the book that I found very interesting. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we can end with this. We're about 36 minutes in. You said that the ending of the book was, the way the plot wrapped up was heartwarming, but then when you thought about it, it was really quite sad. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so brief synopsis. Tom, so Huck, Finn, and Jim, they end up in a town, and Huck gets mistaken for Tom Sawyer by Tom Sawyer's aunt. And then Tom shows up and helps Huck pretend to be him. And it's a bunch of hijinks. It's very funny and very frustrating at the same
It's
time.
like if you have like
Oh,
anxiety or OCD or anything like that, just like be prepared. Be prepared. The last 100 pages of the book or so, or
it feels like the book should be over a long time before it's over.
yeah, you're on pins and needles the whole
Yeah.
last.
So Huck and Tom are, in like you said, in air quotes, trying to get Jim out of prison. Essentially, he's being held by this same family because they're going to try to sell him back or take him back for reward money. Um, and Tom has this whole rigmarole of things they want to go through to get him out so that it can be more like an adventure. They put a bunch of like rats and snakes and spiders in Jim's prison because he's a prisoner and he has to have them.
He quotes about every like romantic
Yeah, Man in the
Count
Iron
of Monte
Mask
Cristo,
and
yeah, Count of
Count of
Monte
Monte
Cristo's
Cristo.
in there, like
Yeah,
every jailbreak book you can think of.
they make him they bake a pie with a rope ladder inside made out of a sheet,
And he
and it
doesn't need a rope ladder.
doesn't need it. No, it's terrible. So in the end, they get him out. Um, and Tom gets shot in the leg at that point, and that's what eventually makes it so that the escape attempt is unsuccessful. Jim is recaptured, but as Tom is telling his aunt, who now has ownership of Jim, what all happened, and she tells Tom, they've recaptured Jim. Tom sits up and says, "No, he's a free man. He was freed months ago because the widow Douglas passed away and she freed Jim." And so all of a sudden, Jim's a free man, and everybody, recognizes Jim for being a good person, for giving himself up so that Tom could be saved because he had that bullet wound. And it seems like the ending of the book is all, hunky dory, as Huck Finn would put it. Um, Jim gets to go back up the river. He's free. He gets a bunch of money. Tom gives him $40, I think,
Yeah,
a bunch of money. And you for a second you feel vindicated, like,
yeah.
all of the trials they went through were
All's well
worth
that
it.
ends well.
All's
Right.
well that ends well. But then you realize that's not true at all because they went through first of all, Jim's been free for a long time, and Tom has been making him go through all of these terrible things just for his own sort of sense of fun. It really is fun. And even beyond that, Jim's family are still slaves. Everyone else is still a slave. The whole system is still in place, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Like, what you realize is that this whole book was essentially an attempt by one man and one boy to escape the poisonous society they live in, and ultimately they failed. And the only thing that made everything else okay was that this old woman died and felt bad enough to free Jim. So it is this weird dissonant ending of both triumph, but then bitter after you realize that it's not really triumphal.
Well, I think my takeaway from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn isn't that the role of fathers is unnecessary. It's that fathers have a greater responsibility to not abdicate those moral duties. And, that we need to be taking stock. And, we're going to make mistakes. I mean, I think the example that you cited of old Jim, of boxing his little deaf daughter's ears, it's an example that I can relate to. Every father goes through a journey, down the Mississippi River of life, I guess. And, thankfully we have opportunities to correct. But one of the things we have to do is we have to be willing to look at our assumptions. And a book like Huck Finn, well read and well analyzed, can help us do that. So I guess that's
Yeah,
my.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, and I would even say, beyond just the books themselves, how much further ahead would our society be if, or let's take it in the book terms. If Huck has kids and he teaches them about his old friend Jim, if how much further ahead would Huck have been if his dad went down the river and looked at his own failings and figured out what the problems were that he didn't believe in, and then passed that on and let Huck then build on that foundation.
I like it.
Yeah. Well,
All
good
right.
book. Glad we get to read this one.
All right, son. Good to talk to you as
Yeah.
always.
Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. This was our episode of Fathers and Sons.
All right. See you later.